The dust cloud rose behind the stagecoach like a funeral shroud as it barreled toward the small Montana settlement of Copper Ridge, and inside sat Eleanor Hayes, with her hands folded tight enough to turn her knuckles white, knowing that her sister Catherine waited ahead with enough venom in her heart to poison everything Eleanor had fled westward to escape. It was August 1878, and the Montana Territory stretched wild and unforgiving around the rutted road that carved through pine forests and rocky outcroppings. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the wooden frame of the coach window, watching the mountains rise in the distance like ancient guardians. She had left St. Louis 3 weeks ago with nothing but 2 carpetbags, a small inheritance from her late mother, and the desperate hope that distance might somehow heal what had been broken between her and Catherine. The other passengers paid her little mind. An older gentleman with silver whiskers dozed across from her, and a young couple with a crying infant occupied the seat beside him. Eleanor envied them their ordinary concerns, their simple journey toward whatever new life awaited them. Her own situation felt like walking into a storm with her eyes wide open. Catherine had written exactly 1 letter in response to Eleanor's notice that she was coming west. The words had been spare and cold. "Come if you must. The settlement needs women. Do not expect warmth." Eleanor had read those lines 100 times during the journey, searching for some softness beneath the brittle exterior, but finding none. Still, Catherine was blood. Catherine was the only family she had left in this world, and Eleanor clung to the fragile hope that time and distance might have softened her sister's anger. The stagecoach lurched over a particularly deep rut, and Eleanor's head knocked against the window frame hard enough to make her wince. The driver shouted something unintelligible from his perch above, and the horses picked up speed despite the rough terrain. Eleanor gripped the edge of her seat and tried to steady her breathing. She had not meant to fall in love with Thomas Whitmore. She had not meant to believe his promises, his declarations of devotion, his whispered plans for their future together. But she had been 20 years old and naive, and Thomas had been handsome and persuasive. What Eleanor had not known, what she could not have known until it was too late, was that Thomas had already promised himself to Catherine, her own sister. And when Catherine discovered Thomas courting Eleanor in secret, the betrayal had shattered their family like a stone through glass. Catherine had called her a liar then, too, had screamed it in front of their dying father, had accused Eleanor of stealing and scheming and manipulating. Eleanor had tried to explain that Thomas had told her he was unattached, that she would never have encouraged his attentions if she had known, but Catherine refused to hear it. And Thomas, coward that he was, had said nothing. He had simply disappeared from both their lives, leaving destruction in his wake. Their father had died, believing Eleanor was a deceiver. That grief sat like a stone in her chest even now, 2 years later. The stagecoach began to slow, and Eleanor realized with a jolt of anxiety that they were approaching Copper Ridge. She could see buildings now through the dust and trees, a small collection of wooden structures that seemed to huddle together for protection against the vast wilderness surrounding them. A general store, a saloon, what looked like a boarding house, and scattered beyond those a handful of cabins and claims where miners and settlers carved out their existence from the unforgiving land. When the stage finally rolled to a stop in front of the general store, Eleanor's legs trembled as she climbed down. The driver handed down her bags with barely a glance, already moving on to help the other passengers. Eleanor stood in the dusty street with the August sun beating down on her dark blue traveling dress and looked around for any sign of Catherine. She did not have to wait long. Catherine emerged from the general store with a basket on her arm and stopped dead when she saw Eleanor standing there. 2 years had changed her sister. Catherine had always been pretty, with honey blonde hair and delicate features that drew admiration wherever she went. But now there was a hardness around her mouth, a tightness in her shoulders that spoke of difficulty endured. She wore a simple calico dress faded from washing, and her hair was pulled back in a severe knot that did nothing to soften her expression. "Eleanor?" Catherine's voice was flat, neither welcoming nor openly hostile. She crossed the distance between them with measured steps, her eyes traveling over Eleanor as if cataloging every detail. "You came. I wrote that I would." Eleanor tried to smile, but her lips felt stiff. "Thank you for agreeing to let me visit." "Visit." Catherine repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. "You have nowhere else to go, do you? That is why you are here." The bluntness stung, but Eleanor could not deny it. After their father's death, the house in St. Louis had been sold to pay his debts. Eleanor had been living with a distant cousin whose patience with her unmarried, unemployed houseguest had worn increasingly thin. Coming west to Catherine had been her last option, and they both knew it. "I hope to make a new start here," Eleanor said quietly. "I can work. I can help however you need." Catherine's laugh was short and sharp. "Work? Yes, I suppose you can work. God knows there is enough of it in this place." She shifted her basket to her other arm and jerked her head toward the edge of town. "I have a cabin about a mile out. The walk will do you good after sitting in that coach." Without waiting for a response, Catherine turned and started walking. Eleanor grabbed her bags and hurried to follow, her arms already aching from the weight. The street gave way to a narrow dirt path that wound through stands of pine and lodgepole, climbing gradually into the foothills. The air smelled of resin and earth and the faint sulfur scent of hot springs somewhere in the distance. It was beautiful country, Eleanor thought, even if her welcome here was anything but. They walked in silence for nearly 20 minutes before Catherine's cabin came into view. It was small and roughly built, with a single room visible through the open door and a lean-to stable beside it where a mule stood swishing its tail at flies. A vegetable garden struggled against the rocky soil in front, and chickens scratched in a makeshift pen. "This is it," Catherine said, setting her basket down on the porch step. "Not much, but it is mine. Well, it belongs to Mr. Harrison, technically. I work for him at his mining operation, keeping accounts and managing his household. This cabin is part of my wages." "It seems very nice," Eleanor offered, though the words felt inadequate. Catherine's eyes cut to her, sharp and assessing. "You can stay in the loft. There is a bedroll up there and space enough if you keep your things tidy. I expect you to earn your keep. The garden needs constant tending, the chickens need feeding and their eggs collected, and I could use help with the washing and cooking. If you think you will sit idle while I work, you are mistaken." "I do not expect to be idle," Eleanor said firmly. "I want to help. I want to make things right between us, Catherine." For a moment something flickered across Catherine's face, something that might have been pain or longing or old grief. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same hard mask. "What is between us cannot be made right with housework and pretty words. You lied to me, Eleanor. You took the man I loved and you destroyed everything." "I did not lie," Eleanor said, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay calm. "Thomas told me he was unattached. He pursued me, Catherine. I did not even know you had an understanding with him until it was too late. If I had known, I would never have—" "Enough!" Catherine held up a hand, her face flushed with anger. "I have heard these excuses before, and I am not interested in hearing them again. You are here because I am Christian enough not to turn away my own blood, but do not expect me to believe your stories. Now, bring your things inside. Supper will be at 6, and I expect you to help prepare it." Eleanor bit back the protest that rose in her throat and gathered her bags. There was no point in arguing, not now. Catherine's mind was set as firmly as it had been 2 years ago, and nothing Eleanor said would change it today. Perhaps over time, with patience and consistent honesty, she could wear down her sister's conviction, or perhaps she was fooling herself, clinging to hope where none existed. The inside of the cabin was spare but clean, with an iron stove in one corner, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. A ladder led up to a loft space tucked under the peaked roof, and Eleanor climbed up to find exactly what Catherine had described: a thin bedroll, a small trunk, and barely enough room to stand upright in the center where the roof was highest. It would be stifling in summer and freezing in winter, but it was shelter. It was more than she had any right to expect given the circumstances. Eleanor unpacked her few belongings and tried to tell herself that this was just the beginning, that things would improve, that somehow she would find a way to prove her innocence to Catherine and rebuild what had been broken. But as she climbed back down the ladder and saw her sister's rigid back as Catherine prepared vegetables for their supper, Eleanor felt the weight of impossibility settle over her shoulders like a yoke. The first week in Copper Ridge passed in a blur of work and careful silence. Eleanor rose before dawn to tend the chickens and help Catherine prepare breakfast. They ate without speaking. Then Catherine would leave for her work at Mr. Harrison's office, while Eleanor stayed behind to weed the garden, haul water, do laundry, and prepare supper. Catherine would return as the sun lowered toward the mountains, and they would eat together in that same strained silence before Eleanor retreated to the loft and Catherine to her bed. It was a lonely existence, but Eleanor threw herself into the work with determination. She would prove herself useful. She would demonstrate through actions what her words could not convey. And slowly, perhaps, Catherine would soften. On the 8th day, Eleanor walked into town to purchase supplies from the general store. Catherine had left a list and a small purse of coins, along with terse instructions about which items to prioritize if the money was not sufficient for everything. Eleanor was grateful for the errand, happy to have a reason to see more of the settlement and perhaps meet some of the other residents. The general store was larger inside than it appeared from the street, with shelves stocked with everything from flour and sugar to mining equipment and ammunition. An older woman stood behind the counter, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and her expression warm as Eleanor entered. "Good morning," the woman said. "You must be Catherine's sister. I heard you had come to stay with her. I am Mrs. Brennan. My husband and I run this store." "Eleanor Hayes," Eleanor said, grateful for the friendliness in the woman's voice. "It is a pleasure to meet you." "How are you settling in?" Mrs. Brennan asked as Eleanor presented the list and began selecting items from the shelves. "Well enough, thank you. Everyone has been very kind." It was not entirely true, given Catherine's coldness, but Eleanor was not about to air her family troubles to a stranger. Mrs. Brennan made a sympathetic sound. "It must be quite an adjustment coming from the city to a place like this. Copper Ridge is rough country, especially for women on their own, but there are good people here too. If you need anything, you just ask." Eleanor thanked her and paid for the supplies, then stepped back out into the morning sunshine with her arms full of parcels. She was halfway down the street toward the path home when she heard shouting coming from the direction of the saloon. A crowd had gathered, and Eleanor could see two men in the center of it, squaring off like they were preparing to fight. One was tall and lean, dressed in the dusty clothes of a miner. The other man made Eleanor stop in her tracks. He was enormous, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His dark hair fell past his collar in waves that looked like they had not seen scissors in months, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was not his size that caught Eleanor's attention. It was the way he stood, perfectly still and calm despite the other man's aggressive posturing, like a mountain that could not be moved no matter how hard the wind blew. "You cheated me, Garrison!" the miner was shouting, jabbing a finger toward the larger man's chest. "That claim you sold me is worthless, nothing but rock and empty promises." The big man, Garrison, shook his head slowly. "I told you exactly what was there. I never promised you would strike it rich. I said the claim had potential but needed working. That is what I said, and nothing more." "You are a liar!" The miner's face was red with rage. "Everyone knows you mountain men are all liars and thieves. You take advantage of honest folks and then disappear into the hills." Eleanor saw Garrison's jaw tighten, but his voice remained level when he spoke. "I have taken advantage of no one. You agreed to the price, and I gave you an honest accounting of what I knew. If you have not found what you hoped, that is the nature of mining, not evidence of my dishonesty." The miner lunged forward as if to throw a punch, but another man from the crowd stepped between them, holding up his hands. "That's enough, Jenkins. You are drunk and making a fool of yourself. Go sleep it off." Jenkins spat into the dust and glared at Garrison with pure hatred, but he allowed himself to be led away toward the boarding house. The crowd began to disperse, returning to their various business. Eleanor found herself staring at the big mountain man, wondering about him. He had handled the confrontation with remarkable restraint, refusing to be provoked despite the insults thrown at him. As if sensing her gaze, Garrison turned and looked directly at her. His eyes were a startling blue, pale and clear as mountain ice, and they held hers for a long moment before he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked away down the street, his long stride carrying him quickly out of sight. Eleanor realized she was still standing frozen in place with her arms full of parcels and her heart beating faster than it should. She shook herself and hurried on toward the path home, trying to dismiss the strange encounter from her mind. She had no business noticing mountain men or anyone else. She was here to reconcile with her sister and build a new life, not to let herself be distracted by compelling blue eyes and an impressive display of self-control. But that evening, As she and Catherine sat across from each other at supper, Eleanor found herself asking, "Who is the man they call Garrison?" Catherine's head snapped up, her expression immediately suspicious. "Why do you ask about him?" "I saw him in town today. There was a disagreement with a miner who accused him of dishonesty." "Garrison is a mountain man," Catherine said, her tone clipped. "He lives up in the high country, trapping and hunting. Sometimes he comes down to trade furs and sell mining claims he has staked. Some people trust him, others do not. I would advise you to stay away from him." "I was not planning to seek him out," Eleanor said, stung by her sister's implication. "I was merely curious." Catherine set down her fork with more force than necessary. "Curious. That is how it starts, is it not? You become curious about a man, and before anyone knows what is happening, you have inserted yourself into his life regardless of who else might have a claim on his affections." The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and bitter. Eleanor felt her own temper rising, but she forced it down. "I asked a simple question, Catherine. I am not scheming to insert myself anywhere. I saw a man standing up for himself with dignity, and I wanted to know who he was, that is all." "Men like Garrison are dangerous," Catherine said, returning her attention to her plate. "They live by their own rules outside of civilized society. He may seem impressive, but he is not the kind of man a decent woman should notice." Eleanor bit her tongue and said nothing more, but privately she thought that Garrison had shown more decency in those few minutes than Thomas Whitmore had demonstrated in all the months she had known him. Not that it mattered. She was not in Montana to find a man. She was here to survive and hopefully repair her relationship with her sister. The following Sunday, Catherine insisted Eleanor accompany her to the small church service held in the back room of the general store. A traveling preacher passed through Copper Ridge once a month, and the settlers gathered to hear him preach and share news with their neighbors. Eleanor dressed in her best remaining dress and walked into town beside her sister, grateful for any opportunity to meet more of the community. The room was crowded with perhaps 30 people, sitting on benches and chairs brought from various homes. Eleanor recognized Mrs. Brennan and her husband and several other faces from her trip to town. Catherine took a seat near the front, and Eleanor settled beside her, folding her hands in her lap and trying to ignore the curious stares directed their way. The preacher was a thin man with a booming voice that seemed too large for his frame. He preached about redemption and forgiveness, about the possibility of new beginnings in the wilderness if one's heart was right with God. Eleanor found herself hanging on every word, desperately wanting to believe that new beginnings were possible for her. After the service ended, people milled about talking while Mrs. Brennan served coffee from a large pot. Catherine was immediately drawn into conversation with a group of women, and Eleanor stood awkwardly to the side, uncertain whether she was included in the invitation or not. "You're Catherine's sister, are you not?" Eleanor turned to find a young woman about her own age smiling at her. She had dark curly hair and friendly brown eyes, and she held a coffee cup in each hand. "Yes, I am Eleanor Hayes. Margaret Cooper. Everyone calls me Maggie." She offered one of the cups to Eleanor. "I help Mrs. Brennan with the store sometimes. Are you planning to stay in Copper Ridge?" "I hope to," Eleanor said gratefully, accepting the coffee. "I'm still finding my footing." "It is not an easy place for women," Maggie said frankly. "There is hard work and not much society. But some of us manage well enough. There's a quilting circle that meets every other Wednesday at the boarding house if you are interested. Catherine comes sometimes." Eleanor glanced at her sister, who was deep in conversation and had not looked in her direction even once. "That sounds lovely. Thank you for telling me." They talked for a few more minutes about harmless topics, and Eleanor felt a small warmth bloom in her chest at this first genuine friendly overture she had received in Copper Ridge. Perhaps she could build a life here after all. Perhaps not everything would be as difficult as her relationship with Catherine. The warmth faded quickly when they walked back to the cabin that afternoon. Catherine was silent for most of the journey, but as they approached the turnoff to their path, she suddenly said, "I saw you talking to Maggie Cooper." "Yes, she was very kind. She invited me to a quilting circle." "Maggie is a good woman," Catherine said, "but I should warn you that she is also friendly with Garrison. He helped her family last winter when they nearly starved, brought them game, and saw to it they had firewood. So Maggie speaks well of him and considers him a friend. If you spend time with Maggie, you are likely to encounter him." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face her sister. "Catherine, Why are you so determined to warn me away from this man? I do not even know him. I have no designs on him or anyone else. I am here to build a new life and to try to make peace with you. That is all I want." Catherine's face flushed. "Because I know you, Eleanor. I know how you operate. You find a man who is spoken for or who owes loyalty elsewhere, and you make yourself appealing to him. You tell your lies and twist things until you have taken what you want." "That is not what happened with Thomas." Eleanor's voice rose, despite her intention to stay calm. "He lied to me, Catherine. He told me he was free to court me. I had no idea about your understanding until your friend Margaret mentioned seeing you with him at the church social. As soon as I knew, I confronted him and ended things. But he denied it, said there was no understanding, that you had misunderstood his intentions. I did not know who to believe, and I made the terrible mistake of letting him convince me that you were the one who was mistaken. I was wrong to doubt you, and I am sorry for that. But I never lied to you, not once." Catherine's eyes were bright with unshed tears, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You expect me to believe that? You expect me to think that you were just an innocent victim in all of this? Thomas loved me. He proposed to me. Eleanor. He gave me a ring and asked me to marry him. And then suddenly, he was spending all his time with you. And when I asked him about it, he said, you needed comforting because of Father's illness. He said he was being neighborly. And all the while, the two of you were carrying on behind my back. I did not know." Eleanor could feel her own tears threatening. "Catherine, please, you have to believe me. He never told me any of that. He never mentioned you at all until it was too late. If I had known, if I had understood, I would never have allowed him to court me. You are my sister. You will always be more important to me than any man." For a moment, Catherine seemed to waver, her rigid posture softening slightly. But then she shook her head hard, as if physically rejecting Eleanor's words. "I cannot believe you. I cannot trust you. Father died thinking you were a deceiver, and I will not dishonor his memory by pretending things were different than they were. You are here because I will not turn family away, but do not expect me to forget what you did." She turned and walked quickly toward the cabin, leaving Eleanor standing alone on the path with tears streaming down her face. The injustice of it burned like acid in her chest. She had been deceived just as much as Catherine had, but her sister refused to see it. Thomas had played them both false, yet somehow Eleanor alone bore the blame. She stood there until her tears dried and her breathing steadied, then followed slowly back to the cabin. There was nowhere else for her to go. She would have to endure Catherine's accusations and hope that time would eventually reveal the truth. But it felt like an impossible task, like trying to convince someone the sky was blue when they insisted on seeing red. 2 weeks later, Eleanor was in the garden pulling weeds in the late afternoon heat when she heard someone approaching the cabin. She straightened up, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her heart skip when she recognized the broad-shouldered figure of Garrison walking up the path. He carried something large over one shoulder, and as he drew closer, she realized it was a deer carcass already field-dressed. "Afternoon," he called out when he was close enough. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel under wagon wheels. "Is Catherine Hayes here?" "She's at work," Eleanor said, wiping her dirty hands on her apron. "She will not return until evening. Can I help you with something?" Garrison shifted the deer slightly on his shoulder. "I owe Catherine for some accounting work she did for me last month. Told her I would pay in meat since she does not have much use for cash this far from a proper town. I can leave this with you if you know how to hang it properly." Eleanor hesitated. She had seen meat hung in the smokehouse behind the cabin, but she had never done it herself. Still, she could figure it out, and Catherine would need the meat. "Yes, I can manage. Thank you for bringing it." Garrison nodded and walked around to the back of the cabin where the smokehouse stood. Eleanor followed, watching as he strung the carcass up on the hooks with efficient, practiced movements. His hands were huge and scarred, but he handled the task with surprising gentleness. "You are Catherine's sister," he said without looking at her. It was not quite a question. "Yes, Eleanor Hayes. Heard you came from St. Louis." He finished securing the deer and stepped back to check his work. "That's a long journey." It was necessary. He turned to look at her then, those pale blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated despite the fact that he towered over her by at least a foot and probably outweighed her by 100 pounds of solid muscle. "Your sister speaks poorly of you," he said bluntly. Eleanor felt her face heat with embarrassment and anger. "I'm aware. Says you are a liar and not to be trusted. My sister believes what she believes." Eleanor lifted her chin. "I cannot control her opinions." Garrison was quiet for a long moment, still watching her with that unsettling directness. Then he said, "I'm a fair judge of character. Part of surviving in the mountains is knowing who you can trust and who you cannot, and I have listened to your sister's words. But I have also watched you these past weeks when I have been in town, the way you carry yourself, the way you work, the way you treat others. Those things tell me more truth than accusations." "You do not even know me," Eleanor said, confused by this unexpected defense. "I know enough." He picked up the rifle he had leaned against the smokehouse wall. "Your sister is angry and hurting, but hurt does not always see clearly. Time will tell the truth of things, one way or another." Before Eleanor could think of a response, he had turned and was walking away down the path with that same long, ground-eating stride she had noticed before. She stood staring after him, her heart beating fast and her thoughts in turmoil. Why had he said those things? What did he care whether Catherine's accusations were true or false? When Catherine returned that evening and saw the deer hanging in the smokehouse, she was pleased until Eleanor mentioned who had brought it. "Garrison was here?" Catherine's expression darkened. "What did he say to you?" "Only that he owed you for accounting work. He hung the deer and left." Catherine studied her suspiciously. "He said nothing else?" Eleanor hesitated, unwilling to lie but uncertain how much to reveal. "He mentioned that you had spoken to him about me, about your opinion of my character." "Good." Catherine's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Then he knows to be wary of you. Garrison is rough around the edges, but he is honest. I would not want him taken in by your manipulations." The accusation stung worse than usual, perhaps because Garrison's unexpected words of defense had given Eleanor a small taste of what it felt like to be believed. She said nothing, just turned away and began preparing their supper while Catherine washed up from her day's work. That night, Eleanor lay in the stifling heat of the loft and thought about the mountain man's pale blue eyes and his quiet certainty when he said that hurt did not always see clearly. She thought about his enormous hands handling the deer carcass with such care and the way he seemed to take up more space than should be physically possible for one man. She thought about how he had stood unmoved while Jenkins shouted accusations at him, refusing to be provoked into violence, and she thought, despite all her intentions to focus only on repairing things with Catherine, that Garrison was unlike any man she had ever met. There was a solidity to him, a groundedness that made Thomas Whitmore seem like nothing more than a shallow boy playing at being a man. Not that it mattered, she reminded herself firmly. She was not looking for a man, and even if she were, Catherine had already warned Garrison against her. Any interest she might develop would be pointless and doomed from the start. Still, when she finally fell asleep, her dreams were full of mountain peaks and pale blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. The next morning, Eleanor walked to town earlier than usual, hoping to catch Maggie Cooper at the general store and ask about the quilting circle. She found Maggie helping Mrs. Brennan unpack a shipment of fabric that had arrived on yesterday's freight wagon. "Eleanor," Maggie's face lit up when she saw her. "Perfect timing. We just got in the most beautiful calico, and Mrs. Brennan is offering a discount if we buy enough for a full quilt pattern. Are you interested?" Eleanor glanced at the bolts of fabric, her fingers itching to touch the soft cotton. She had always loved handwork, and it had been months since she had done any sewing beyond basic mending. "How much would it cost?" Maggie quoted a price that was within Eleanor's limited means if she was careful. After a moment of internal debate, Eleanor nodded. "Yes, I would like that. Thank you for thinking of me." They spent a pleasant hour selecting fabrics and discussing quilt patterns, and by the time Eleanor left the store with her parcel, she felt more hopeful than she had in weeks. Maggie had confirmed that the next quilting circle was this Wednesday afternoon, and she had insisted Eleanor come, whether Catherine accompanied her or not. "We are a friendly group," Maggie said warmly, "and we are always happy to have another set of hands. Some of the older women will try to lecture you about proper stitching techniques, but you just smile and nod and keep doing things your own way. That is what I do." Eleanor laughed, and it felt strange and wonderful to laugh after so many days of tension and silence. She walked home feeling lighter than she had since arriving in Montana. That lightness lasted until Wednesday afternoon when she told Catherine she was going to the quilting circle. Catherine looked up from the accounts she was reviewing for Mr. Harrison. "I'm not going today. I have too much work." "I know. Maggie said it was fine for me to come alone." Something shifted in Catherine's expression. "You seem to have become quite close with Maggie very quickly." "She's been kind to me," Eleanor said carefully. "I thought you said she was a good woman." "She is, but Maggie has her own opinions about people, and they do not always align with truth. I would not want her filling your head with ideas that are not appropriate." Eleanor felt a flash of frustration. "What ideas?" "Catherine, I am simply going to a quilting circle. I am not plotting anything or scheming anything. I am trying to build a life here, just as you suggested I should." "Fine." Catherine returned her attention to her papers. "Go if you must, but do not be surprised if there are consequences to the friendships you choose." Eleanor bit back a sharp reply and left before she said something she would regret. She walked to town with her fabric parcel under her arm and her temper simmering just beneath the surface. Every day it seemed Catherine found new ways to cast suspicion on Eleanor's motives, new methods of twisting innocent actions into evidence of deception. The quilting circle was held in a room at the boarding house that the owner had set aside for community gatherings. 6 women were already there when Eleanor arrived, including Maggie and Mrs. Brennan. They greeted her warmly and made space at the quilting frame for her to work. Eleanor settled in and lost herself in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread, grateful for the companionship and the gentle buzz of conversation around her. About an hour into the afternoon, the door opened and Garrison ducked through it, his head nearly brushing the frame. Every woman in the room looked up, and Eleanor noticed several appreciative glances directed at the mountain man, despite the gold bands on their fingers. "Afternoon, ladies," Garrison said, his deep voice seeming to fill the small space. "Maggie, I brought those supplies you asked for. Left them with Sam at the front desk." "Thank you, Garrison," Maggie said with a warm smile. "You are a lifesaver. Do you have time for coffee? We have extra." "Cannot today. Heading back up to my cabin before dark." His eyes traveled around the room and landed on Eleanor for just a moment. Something flickered in his expression, but it was gone before she could interpret it. Then he nodded to the group and left as quickly as he had come. That man," one of the older women said with a sigh. "If I were 20 years younger and not already married, I would set my cap for him despite his rough edges." Several of the women laughed, and Maggie shook her head fondly. "Garrison is a good man. He has helped half the families in Copper Ridge at one time or another, but he never asks for anything in return. Last winter when my father broke his leg and could not work, Garrison brought us meat and firewood every week until Pa healed up. Would not take a penny for it." "Catherine does not think highly of him," Eleanor found herself saying before she could stop the words. "She warned me to stay away from him." Maggie's expression turned thoughtful. "Your sister has strong opinions about many things, but I have known Garrison for 3 years now, and I have never seen him be anything but honest and fair. If he makes a promise, he keeps it. If he gives his word, you can trust it. That is more than I can say for a lot of men." Eleanor thought about that as she walked home later that afternoon. Catherine had accused Garrison of being dangerous, of living outside civilized rules, but everything Eleanor had seen and heard suggested the opposite. He seemed to be a man of integrity, someone who kept his word and helped others without expecting reward, the kind of man who would defend a woman's character even when her own sister spoke against her. The thought made her chest feel tight and warm in a way she did not want to examine too closely. That evening at supper, Catherine asked pointed questions about the quilting circle. Who had been there, what they had talked about, whether anyone had mentioned Eleanor specifically. Eleanor answered as honestly as she could, but she found herself omitting any mention of Garrison's brief appearance. Some instinct warned her that Catherine would find a way to twist it into evidence of Eleanor's supposed scheming, and she could not bear another accusation today. The omission felt like a tiny crack in the foundation of honesty she was trying to build with her sister, but Eleanor told herself it was a necessary protection. Some things Catherine simply did not need to know. 2 weeks passed in the same pattern. Eleanor worked hard around the cabin and made more trips into town, slowly building friendships with Maggie and some of the other women. She attended quilting circles and helped Mrs. Brennan at the store occasionally in exchange for supplies. Catherine remained cold and suspicious, but Eleanor continued to try to prove herself through steady, honest behavior. And several times she encountered Garrison in town or on the path near their cabin. Each time he would nod to her in acknowledgement, sometimes offering a brief greeting, sometimes nothing more than that pale blue gaze that seemed to see too much. Eleanor found herself looking for him without meaning to, her heart beating faster when she caught sight of his broad shoulders or heard his deep voice. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply grateful to have one person in Copper Ridge who did not view her with immediate suspicion. But late at night in the loft, she admitted to herself that it was more than that. There was something about Garrison that drew her like metal to a lodestone. His quiet strength, his unshakable calm, the way he moved through the world with such confidence despite his isolation from the settlement. She wanted to know him better. She wanted to understand what had driven him to live alone in the mountains, what he thought about during the long winter nights, what made him smile beneath that dark beard. But wanting was dangerous. Wanting was what had led her into trouble with Thomas Whitmore, believing his lies because she wanted to believe someone could love her. She would not make that mistake again. She would keep her distance from Garrison and focus on the reasons she had come to Montana in the first place. That resolution lasted until the morning she went to collect eggs from the chicken coop and found a cougar crouched on the roof of the lean-to stable, its golden eyes fixed on Catherine's mule inside. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The big cat was enormous, easily 6 feet long, not counting its tail, and she could see the powerful muscles bunching beneath its tawny hide as it prepared to spring. If it attacked the mule, the poor animal would have no chance, and if Eleanor startled it or got in its way, she would have no chance either. She backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. The cougar's head swiveled toward her, ears flattening against its skull. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She was still 20 yards from the cabin door, and there was no way she could outrun the animal if it decided to attack her instead of the mule. The crack of a rifle shot split the morning air, and the cougar jerked and tumbled from the roof of the lean-to. It hit the ground hard, twitched once, and lay still. Eleanor spun around to see Garrison striding toward her from the tree line, his rifle still raised to his shoulder. He crossed the distance in seconds and positioned himself between Eleanor and the dead cougar, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest as if checking for additional threats. "Are you hurt?" His voice was sharp with urgency. "No, I'm fine. I was going to collect eggs." Eleanor heard the tremor in her own voice and hated it. "Thank you. If you had not been here, I was checking my trap line and saw the cat from the ridge." He lowered his rifle but continued to watch the forest. "Been tracking it for 2 days. It killed a settler's calf last week and I wanted to take it before it hurt someone." Eleanor looked at the cougar's body and felt her knees go weak as she realized how close she had come to being mauled. "I did not know they came down this close to the cabins. They do not usually, unless they are desperate or sick. This one was old and missing several teeth. Makes it harder to take down normal prey, so it started going after easier targets." Garrison finally looked down at her, and his expression softened slightly. "You did the right thing, backing away slow. Running would have triggered its hunting instinct." "I was too frightened to run," Eleanor admitted. The corner of his mouth twitched beneath his beard, almost a smile. "Fear can keep you alive if you let it guide you instead of control you. You did well." The praise warmed her more than it should have. She watched as he approached the cougar and checked to make sure it was truly dead, then began the work of preparing the hide. His movements were efficient and practiced, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away from the play of muscles across his shoulders as he worked. "Your sister will want to know about this," he said without looking up. "Cougar this close to the cabin means she should be more careful. Keep that mule inside at night until we are sure there are no others in the area." "I will tell her. Thank you again for—" Eleanor gestured helplessly at the cougar. "For saving my life." Now he did look up, those blue eyes catching hers and holding. "You are welcome, Eleanor Hayes." It was the first time he had said her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made something flutter in her chest. She nodded quickly and turned back toward the cabin, needing distance before she did something foolish like ask him to stay for breakfast or tell him that she thought about him far more often than was appropriate. She was halfway to the door when he called out, "Eleanor!" She turned back. He had stood up from his work on the cougar, and he was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Your sister is wrong about you," he said. "I thought you should know that. I have been watching, and I have seen enough to be certain. You are not a liar. You are not someone who schemes to hurt others. Whatever happened between you and your sister, I do not believe it was your fault." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "You cannot know that. I can know what I see, and I see a woman who works hard, treats others with kindness, and carries herself with honesty even when she is accused of the opposite. That tells me everything I need to know." "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. "You cannot know how much it means to hear someone say that." He nodded once, then returned to his work. Eleanor went inside the cabin and sat down heavily at the table, her hands shaking. Garrison believed her. A man who barely knew her had looked at her actions and decided she was honest. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. When Catherine came home that evening and Eleanor told her about the cougar, Catherine's first response was irritation. "Garrison was here again? What was he doing so close to our cabin?" "He was tracking the cougar. Catherine, it was about to attack your mule. If he had not killed it, we could have lost the animal, or I could have been hurt." Catherine's expression softened slightly. "I suppose we should be grateful then, but I still do not like how often that man seems to appear around you. He was not here to see me. He was hunting a dangerous animal." "Even so." Catherine moved to the window and looked out toward where Garrison had dragged the cougar's carcass away from the cabin. "Men like him do not do things without a reason. If he is taking such an interest in our property, he must want something." Eleanor bit her tongue against the protest that rose up. There was no point arguing. Catherine had made up her mind about Garrison just as she had made up her mind about Eleanor, and no amount of evidence to the contrary would change it. But that night in the loft, Eleanor let herself imagine what it might be like if Catherine were not standing between them. If she were free to thank Garrison properly, to invite him to stay for a meal, to sit and talk with him and learn more about his life in the mountains. She imagined what it might feel like to have those strong arms around her, making her feel safe and protected. She imagined his deep voice saying her name again, but softer, with warmth and affection. The images made her face burn in the darkness, and she forced them away. Wanting was dangerous. Wanting would only lead to heartache. She had to remember that. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hint of gold on the aspen leaves. Eleanor had been in Copper Ridge for a month now, and while her relationship with Catherine had not improved, at least it had not gotten worse. They existed in an uneasy stalemate, working side by side, but rarely talking about anything beyond practical matters. Eleanor had become a regular at the quilting circle, and Maggie Cooper had become a true friend. They would sometimes walk together after the meetings ended, talking about everything and nothing. Maggie spoke freely about her life, her hopes of eventually marrying and having children, her frustration with the limited opportunities available to women in the territory. "Sometimes I think about leaving," Maggie admitted one afternoon as they walked along the creek that ran past the settlement. "Going to San Francisco or Denver, somewhere with more than one street and 30 buildings. But then I think about my parents getting older and how they need me here. And truthfully, I love these mountains. They get under your skin after a while." "I can understand that," Eleanor said. "I never expected to find beauty in such wild country, but there is something magnificent about it." "That is exactly it. Magnificent." Maggie grinned at her. "You are turning into a Montana woman, Eleanor Hayes. Soon you will be able to shoot a rifle and field dress a deer all by yourself." Eleanor laughed. "I think that might be beyond my abilities, but I am learning to be tougher than I was." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Maggie said casually, "Garrison asked about you yesterday." Eleanor's heart skipped. "He did?" "He wanted to know if you were settling in well, if you needed anything. I told him you were doing fine and making friends." Maggie glanced at her sideways. "He seems to have taken an interest in your welfare." "He feels responsible because he saved me from that cougar," Eleanor said quickly. "It does not mean anything beyond that." "If you say so." But Maggie's tone suggested she did not quite believe it. Eleanor wanted to ask what else Garrison had said, whether he had mentioned her specifically or just asked generally about newcomers to the settlement. But she bit back the questions. She had no right to be curious about Garrison's interest in her. She had no right to hope that he might feel even a fraction of the attraction that pulled at her whenever she saw him. The following Sunday after church, Mr. Harrison approached Eleanor and asked if she would be interested in helping with bookkeeping work. Catherine had apparently mentioned that Eleanor was educated and skilled with figures, and Harrison's business had grown beyond what Catherine could manage alone. "I can offer modest wages," Harrison said. He was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a shrewd but not unkind expression. "Nothing extravagant, but enough to help you start building some independence. Catherine speaks highly of your abilities, even if she does not speak highly of you personally." The blunt assessment of Catherine's feelings stung, but Eleanor appreciated his honesty. "I would be very interested, Mr. Harrison. Thank you for the opportunity." "Good. Come by my office tomorrow morning and I will show you what needs doing. Fair warning, my records are in something of a mess. The previous bookkeeper left suddenly and did not organize things properly before he went." Eleanor spent that evening trying to control her excitement. Paid work meant independence. It meant the ability to save money, to eventually find her own place if Catherine never softened toward her. It meant hope for a future that was not entirely dependent on her sister's grudging charity. Catherine's reaction was more complicated. "I recommended you because Harrison needed help, and you needed employment," she said stiffly. "Do not think it means I have changed my opinion about what happened in St. Louis." "I did not think that," Eleanor said quietly. "But I appreciate your recommendation regardless. I know it could not have been easy to speak positively about me to your employer." Something flickered across Catherine's face, but she turned away before Eleanor could interpret it. "Just do good work and do not embarrass me. That is all I ask." Eleanor started work for Mr. Harrison the next morning and discovered that he had not exaggerated about the state of his records. The previous bookkeeper had been careless and possibly dishonest, mixing personal and business accounts in ways that made it almost impossible to track actual profits and losses. Eleanor threw herself into the task of sorting it all out, grateful for work that required her full concentration, and left no room for brooding about Catherine's continued coldness or her confusing feelings about Garrison. She was deep in a particularly tangled set of mining claim records 3 days later, when the office door opened and Garrison walked in. Eleanor's head snapped up, her heart immediately beating faster. "Afternoon," Garrison said, nodding to her. "Is Harrison here?" "He's down at the mill." Eleanor set down her pen, suddenly very aware of the ink stains on her fingers and the curl of hair that had escaped her pins to fall across her forehead. "He should return within the hour if you want to wait." Garrison seemed to consider this, then shook his head. "I will come back later. Just needed to discuss a timber contract with him." He turned to leave, but Eleanor found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "Mr. Garrison, I never properly thanked you for killing that cougar. You very likely saved my life, and all I gave you was a few stammered words of gratitude. It was not adequate." He turned back, his blue eyes studying her face. "There is no debt between us. I would have done the same for anyone. Perhaps, but you did it for me, and I am grateful." She hesitated, then added, "My sister may have warned you against me, but I hope you will not judge me solely on her accusations. I am not the person she believes me to be." "I know." His voice was quiet but certain. "I told you before that I am a fair judge of character. I have watched you these past weeks, Eleanor. The way you carry yourself with dignity despite your sister's coldness, the way you work hard without complaint, the way you treat others with kindness, even when you receive little kindness in return. Those things tell me who you are far more clearly than any accusations." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You have been watching me? Hard not to notice you when I come to town." A hint of something that might have been humor touched his voice. "You stand out. Because I am an outsider? Because you are beautiful, honest, and brave. Those qualities are rare enough to stand out anywhere." Eleanor's breath caught. Had he really just called her beautiful? She searched his face for signs of mockery or manipulation, but found only simple honesty in those pale eyes. He meant it. He truly meant it. "Thank you," she managed. "That is, no one has said anything like that to me in a very long time." Then the men in St. Louis were fools. He shifted his rifle slightly on his shoulder. I should go. But Eleanor, if you ever need anything at all, you can ask me. I mean that. Why? The question burst out before she could stop it. Why do you care what happens to me? You barely know me. Garrison was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor thought he might not answer. But then he said, because I recognize injustice when I see it. You are being punished for something you did not do, and that sits wrong with me. And because... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Because I see something in you that calls to something in me. Cannot explain it better than that. But I know it is there, and I know it is real. Before Eleanor could respond, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving her staring after him with her heart pounding and her thoughts in complete chaos. He felt it too. This pull, this connection that seemed to exist between them despite barely knowing each other. She was not imagining it. But what did it mean? And what could she possibly do about it with Catherine standing guard over her reputation like a vengeful angel? Eleanor tried to focus on her work for the rest of the afternoon, but the numbers kept blurring together on the page. She kept replaying Garrison's words in her mind, the quiet certainty in his voice when he said she was beautiful and honest and brave, the way he had admitted to feeling a connection to her, even if he could not explain it properly. No man had ever spoken to her that way before. Thomas Whitmore had been full of flowery compliments and elaborate declarations, but they had all felt hollow in retrospect. Garrison's simple, direct words carried more weight than all of Thomas's poetry combined. When Eleanor walked home that evening, she found Catherine already at the cabin preparing supper. Her sister glanced up when Eleanor entered, then did a double take. "Why is your face flushed? Are you feeling ill?" "No, I'm fine. Just warm from the walk." Eleanor busied herself with washing up, not wanting Catherine to see her expression. But Catherine, and some part of her wanted to be honest, wanted to claim this small piece of happiness, even if Catherine disapproved. "Garrison came to the office looking for Mr. Harrison. We spoke briefly. That is all." Catherine's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "I knew it. I knew he was taking too much interest in you." "What did he say?" "Nothing inappropriate. He simply thanked me for passing on his message, and we exchanged a few pleasantries." "You are lying." Catherine slammed the pot she was holding down on the stove hard enough to make Eleanor jump. "I can see it in your face. Something more happened. What did he say to you?" Eleanor's own temper finally broke free of the tight control she had been maintaining. "He said that he believes I am honest. He said that he has watched me, and he can see that I am not the liar you accuse me of being. He said he recognizes injustice when he sees it, and he thinks I am being punished for something I did not do. Are you happy now? Catherine? Are you satisfied to know that at least one person in this settlement does not think I am a scheming deceiver?" Catherine recoiled as if Eleanor had struck her. "You are trying to seduce him, just like you seduced Thomas." "I did not seduce Thomas, and I am not trying to seduce Garrison. I barely know the man, Catherine, but he has shown me more kindness and understanding in a few brief conversations than you have shown me in all the weeks I have been here. Can you not see how that makes me feel? Can you not understand how lonely and horrible it is to live with someone who thinks the worst of you every single moment of every single day?" Tears were streaming down Eleanor's face now, and she could not stop them. All the hurt and frustration and loneliness of the past month came pouring out in a flood. "I loved you, Catherine. You were my sister, my best friend, the person I trusted most in the world. And when everything fell apart with Thomas, all I wanted was for you to believe me. But you would not even listen. You decided I was guilty, and nothing I said made any difference. Do you have any idea how that felt? Do you know what it was like to watch Father die thinking I was a liar, knowing that you had convinced him of it?" Catherine's face had gone from flushed to ashen. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the stove. "You broke my heart, Eleanor. You took the man I loved and you destroyed my future. How am I supposed to forgive that? How am I supposed to believe you when the evidence was so clear?" "What evidence?" Eleanor's voice rose despite her effort to control it. "What evidence did you have besides Thomas suddenly showing me attention? Did you ever think to ask him directly what was happening? Did you ever demand that he explain himself?" "I did ask him. Catherine shouted back. "I asked him dozens of times. He kept saying you were just friends, that he was being kind to you because of Father's illness. But I saw the way he looked at you, Eleanor. I saw the way you looked at him. And when I finally confronted him and demanded to know if he had feelings for you, do you know what he said? He said he was confused, that he cared for both of us and did not know what to do, that you had made him question everything he thought he wanted." Eleanor felt like she had been punched in the stomach. "He told me he had never made any promises to you. He said you had misunderstood his courtship, that you were just friends. Catherine, he lied to both of us. Can you not see that? He played us against each other and then disappeared when the situation became too difficult for him to manage. We are both victims here, not enemies." Catherine shook her head violently. "No, no, you are trying to twist things again, just like you always do. Thomas loved me. He proposed to me. And then you came along with your pretty face and your wounded damsel act, and you stole him away. That is what happened, and no amount of explanation will change it. I cannot do this anymore." Eleanor's voice broke. "I cannot keep living here, constantly being accused and suspected and hated. I will find somewhere else to stay. I will sleep in the barn at the boarding house if I have to. But I will not continue to let you punish me for something I did not do." She turned toward the ladder to the loft, intending to pack her few belongings immediately, but Catherine's voice stopped her. "Wait." The word was barely a whisper. Eleanor turned back. Catherine had sunk into one of the chairs at the table, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. "I do not want you to leave," Catherine said through her tears. "I do not want to lose you completely. You are the only family I have left, Eleanor. But I do not know how to let go of this anger. It has been eating at me for 2 years, and I do not know how to stop it." Eleanor stood frozen, torn between her own hurt and the desperate loneliness in her sister's voice. Slowly, carefully, she crossed to the table and sat down in the other chair. "I do not know how to prove my innocence to you, Catherine. I have told you the truth over and over, but you refuse to believe it. What more can I do?" Catherine looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I do not know. I wish I did. But every time I look at you, I see Thomas. I see him choosing you over me. I see my future disappearing, because you were more interesting, more appealing, more worthy of his love than I was." "That's not what happened," Eleanor said softly. "Thomas was a coward and a liar who hurt both of us. But I never tried to take him from you, Catherine. I swear to you on Mother's grave, I did not know about your engagement until it was too late. And as soon as I knew, I ended things with him. That is the truth, whether you believe it or not." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the stove. Finally, Catherine said, "Garrison really believes you are innocent?" "He says he does." "And you care what he thinks?" It was not quite a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "Yes, I suppose I do." Catherine wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "I have known Garrison for over a year. He helped me when I first came to Copper Ridge and did not know anyone. He fixed the roof on this cabin when it was leaking, and he made sure I had meat through last winter. He is a good man, Eleanor, a truly good man. If he sees something in you that makes him believe you are honest, then maybe—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. But Eleanor heard it anyway. Maybe Catherine had been wrong. Maybe Eleanor was telling the truth after all. It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was the first crack in the wall Catherine had built between them, and Eleanor clung to it like a lifeline. I will stay," Eleanor said quietly. "If you are willing to try to believe me. To really try, Catherine, not just pretend. But I need you to understand that I cannot go on like this much longer. The constant accusations are breaking me." Catherine nodded slowly. "I will try. I do not know if I can fully believe you yet. But I will try to listen with an open mind. That is the best I can offer right now." "Then I will take it." Eleanor reached across the table and carefully placed her hand over Catherine's. Her sister did not pull away, and Eleanor felt a small seed of hope plant itself in her chest. Perhaps they could find their way back to each other after all. Perhaps the damage was not irreparable. They finished preparing supper together in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, less hostile, more contemplative. And when they sat down to eat, Catherine actually asked Eleanor about her work for Mr. Harrison, seeming genuinely interested in the answer. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. That night, Eleanor lay in the loft and thought about everything that had changed in the course of one afternoon. Garrison's words, her confrontation with Catherine, the first tentative steps toward reconciliation. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet, like everything that had seemed impossible this morning was now hovering just on the edge of possible. And she thought about Garrison saying he felt a connection to her, something he could not explain but knew was real. She thought about his blue eyes and his quiet strength and the way he had defended her character without being asked. She thought about how safe she had felt standing near him, even with a dead cougar at their feet, how his presence seemed to anchor her in a way nothing else in Montana had managed to do. She was falling in love with him. The realization hit her like a physical blow, leaving her breathless in the darkness. She barely knew him, had spent perhaps an hour total in his company over the past month and a half. But she was falling in love with him anyway, with his honesty and his strength and the way he saw her clearly when everyone else seemed determined to view her through the distorted lens of Catherine's accusations. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, and she had no idea what to do about it. October brought the first snow to the high peaks and a sharp chill to the mornings. Eleanor continued working for Mr. Harrison, slowly bringing order to his chaotic accounts. Catherine remained distant but no longer openly hostile, and occasionally they would have conversations that almost felt like the ones they used to share before Thomas Whitmore destroyed everything. Eleanor attended quilting circles faithfully and helped Maggie Cooper with various tasks around the settlement. She was becoming part of the community, no longer viewed as just Catherine's disgraced sister, but as a person in her own right. It felt good to be known for her own actions rather than her sister's accusations, and Garrison continued to appear in her life with surprising regularity. He would stop by the office to conduct business with Mr. Harrison, and he always took a moment to speak with Eleanor. Their conversations were brief and carefully proper, but Eleanor treasured every word. He told her about the mountains, about tracking game and reading weather signs in the clouds. She told him about St. Louis, about the bookstore she used to visit and the concerts she had attended with her father. They shared small pieces of their lives like precious gifts, building a foundation of knowledge about each other, one conversation at a time. Eleanor was careful never to mention these encounters to Catherine. It was not exactly dishonest, she told herself. She simply chose not to bring up things that would cause unnecessary conflict. But late at night, she would lie in the loft and feel guilty about the omission, wondering if she was repeating the same mistakes that had led to disaster with Thomas. The difference, she told herself, was that there was nothing improper happening between her and Garrison. They talked in public places where anyone could see. They never touched beyond the occasional polite handshake. They made no promises or declarations. There was nothing to hide, really, except her growing feelings for him. And those she could hardly help. In late October, Mr. Harrison asked Eleanor to deliver some documents to a mining camp about 5 miles into the foothills. Catherine was horrified when she heard. "You cannot go alone. The trail is rough and there are wild animals. Ask Harrison to send someone with you." "Mr. Harrison needs everyone else for other tasks today," Eleanor said, touched despite herself by Catherine's concern. "I will be fine. It is daylight and the trail is well marked. I will take the rifle and be back before dark." Catherine bit her lip, clearly torn between her protective instincts and her reluctance to admit she cared about Eleanor's safety. Finally, she said, "At least tell someone where you are going. Tell Maggie or leave word at the general store. That way, if something happens, people will know to look for you." Eleanor agreed and set out mid-morning with the documents in her satchel and the rifle slung over her shoulder. The trail was indeed well marked, winding up through pine forests that grew denser as she climbed. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine resin and the faint mineral smell of mountain streams. Eleanor found herself enjoying the solitude, despite the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. She was about 3 miles in when she heard voices ahead on the trail. Male voices, loud and rough. Eleanor slowed her pace, suddenly wary. The trail rounded a large boulder and opened into a small clearing where 3 men stood around a campfire. They looked up as she approached, and Eleanor's heart sank as she recognized one of them as Jenkins, the miner who had accused Garrison of cheating him weeks ago. "Well, well," Jenkins said, his lips pulling into an unpleasant smile. "Look what we have here, boys. Catherine Hayes's little sister, all alone in the woods. That's not very smart, Miss Hayes. All kinds of dangerous things in these mountains." Eleanor stopped walking, her hand tightening on the rifle. "I'm just passing through on business for Mr. Harrison. I do not want any trouble." "No trouble here," Jenkins said, taking a step toward her. His companions spread out slightly, and Eleanor realized with a jolt of fear that they were positioning themselves to cut off her retreat. "We are just friendly miners having our lunch. Care to join us?" "No, thank you. I need to be on my way." Eleanor tried to keep her voice steady, but she could hear the tremor in it. Jenkins's smile widened. "Aw, do not be like that. We are just being neighborly. Your sister is not real popular in town, you know, always acting like she is better than everyone else. But maybe you are different. Maybe you are the friendly type." He took another step forward, and Eleanor raised the rifle, pointing it directly at his chest. "Do not come any closer. I know how to use this, and I will if I have to." Jenkins laughed, but he stopped moving. "Feisty. I like that. But sweetheart, there are 3 of us and 1 of you. Even if you manage to shoot me, my friends here will be on you before you can reload. So why do not you just put that rifle down and be reasonable?" Eleanor's mind raced. He was right that she could not fight all 3 of them. Her only hope was to make enough noise that someone else on the trail might hear and come to investigate, or to wound one of them badly enough that the others lost their nerve. Either way, she was not putting down the rifle. I said, "Back away." She cocked the hammer, hoping the sound would emphasize her seriousness. "I will shoot if you force me to." The other 2 men exchanged glances, suddenly looking less certain, but Jenkins just grinned. "You do not have the courage to shoot a man in cold blood. I can see it in your eyes. You are just a soft city girl playing tough. Now put down the rifle before someone gets hurt." He lunged forward, clearly planning to grab the weapon from her hands. Eleanor did not think, just reacted. She pulled the trigger and the rifle roared, the recoil slamming into her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble back. Jenkins screamed and dropped to the ground, clutching his leg where the bullet had torn through his thigh. The other 2 men stared in shock, and Eleanor fumbled to reload with shaking hands. She was not sure she could manage it before they rushed her. But before either of them could move, a new voice rang out from the trees. "You boys thinking about doing something stupid?" Garrison stepped out of the forest, like he had materialized from the mountain itself. His rifle was already raised and pointed at the 2 standing men, and his expression was absolutely cold. Eleanor had never been so grateful to see anyone in her entire life. "She shot Jenkins," one of the men protested. "She is crazy." "I saw what happened. Jenkins tried to grab her weapon after she warned him to stay back. That is self-defense where I come from." Garrison's voice was utterly calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Now you boys are going to help your friend back to town and get him to the doctor, and you are going to spread the word that Eleanor Hayes is under my protection. Anyone who bothers her will answer to me. We clear?" The men nodded frantically and moved to help Jenkins, who was moaning and cursing. Garrison kept his rifle trained on them until they had disappeared down the trail toward Copper Ridge, half carrying their wounded companion between them. Only then did he lower his weapon and turn to Eleanor. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand, the rifle dangling from nerveless fingers. Garrison crossed to her in 2 long strides and carefully took the weapon from her hands. "Are you hurt?" His voice was gentle now, all the cold steel gone. "No, I am fine. I am sorry. I did not mean to shoot him. I just panicked and—" "You did exactly right." Garrison set both rifles aside and placed his large hands on her shoulders, steadying her. "He was going to hurt you, Eleanor. You defended yourself. There's no shame in that." "How did you know I was here? How did you find me?" "I was heading down to the settlement when I saw you leave town. Something did not sit right about you going up into the hills alone, so I followed to make sure you were safe. Good thing I did." Eleanor looked up at him, at the concern clear in his pale blue eyes, and felt something break open inside her chest. This man who barely knew her had followed her into the mountains to ensure her safety. This man believed in her innocence when her own sister would not. This man made her feel seen and valued in a way she had never experienced before. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have saved me twice now." "I would save you 1,000 times if that is what it took." His hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. "Eleanor, I need to say something, and I need you to listen carefully. What I told you before about feeling a connection between us, it is more than that. These past weeks of seeing you, talking to you, watching you build a life here despite all the obstacles in your way, I have come to care for you deeply. I know it is too soon. I know your situation with your sister is complicated, but I cannot keep pretending what I feel is anything less than it is. I am falling in love with you." Eleanor's breath caught. "Garrison, let me finish." His blue eyes held hers with intensity that made her heart race. "I do not expect you to feel the same. I am rough and unpolished, and I live alone in the mountains like some kind of hermit. I am not the kind of man most women would want. But I need you to know that if you ever decide you could care for someone like me, I would spend every day of my life proving myself worthy of you. I would protect you and cherish you and never, never doubt your word. Because I know in my bones that you are exactly who you appear to be, honest, brave, and true." Tears were streaming down Eleanor's face again, but this time they were tears of joy and relief and overwhelming emotion. "You do not have to prove anything to me, Garrison. I already care for you. I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was too soon and too complicated, and I could not afford to trust my feelings again after what happened with Thomas. But I care for you so much it frightens me. You make me feel safe and seen in a way no one else ever has." Something in his expression softened, and he lifted one hand to gently wipe the tears from her cheek. "Then we will figure out the complications together, one step at a time. But first, let me take you to complete your errand and then escort you safely home. Your sister is probably worrying herself sick by now." They completed the delivery to the mining camp and started back toward Copper Ridge as the afternoon sun angled toward evening. They walked close together, not quite touching, but near enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth of his presence beside her. She felt safer than she had in years, protected not just by his physical strength, but by the steadiness of his character. When they reached the outskirts of town, Garrison stopped. "I should leave you here. If I escort you all the way to your cabin, it will cause talk. Your reputation is already precarious because of your sister's accusations. I do not want to make things worse for you." "I do not care about talk," Eleanor said fiercely. "Let them say what they want. You saved my life today, Garrison. I will not pretend otherwise to protect my reputation." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth beneath his beard. "That is my brave Eleanor. But still, for now, let us be cautious. Give your sister time to adjust to the idea of us before we announce it to the whole settlement." Eleanor knew he was right, even though part of her wanted to declare her feelings from the rooftop of the general store. "Will I see you soon?" "Tomorrow, if you want. I will come to Harrison's office with some business to discuss. We can talk then." He reached out and took her hand, his rough palm engulfing her smaller one. "Sleep well, Eleanor Hayes, and know that you have made me happier today than I have been in more years than I can count." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, then released her and disappeared back into the trees like a shadow. Eleanor stood staring after him for a long moment, her hand tingling where his lips had touched. Then she turned and practically ran toward the cabin, bursting with the need to tell someone, anyone, about what had happened. But when she reached the cabin, she found Catherine pacing frantically in front of it. Her sister's face was pale with worry, but it transformed to relief when she saw Eleanor approaching. "Thank God! I have been imagining all sorts of horrible things. Did you complete your errand? Did anything happen?" Eleanor hesitated, then decided honesty was better than evasion. "Something did happen. I encountered Jenkins and 2 other men on the trail. They tried to accost me, and I shot Jenkins in the leg when he lunged at me. But Garrison appeared and made sure I was safe. He escorted me to complete the delivery and saw me safely back." Catherine sank down onto the porch step as if her legs would no longer hold her. "You shot someone?" "Eleanor, this is serious. Jenkins will press charges. You could be arrested." "It was self-defense. Garrison saw everything and will testify to that fact." Eleanor sat down beside her sister. "Catherine, I need to tell you something else. Garrison told me today that he cares for me, and I care for him too. I know you have reservations about him, but he is a good man, the best man I have ever known, and I want to see where these feelings might lead, even if it is complicated." Catherine was silent for a long moment, staring out at the darkening forest. Finally, she said, "I have been thinking a lot these past weeks about what you said, about Thomas lying to both of us, about how Garrison defended your character even though I had spoken against you. And I have been watching you, Eleanor. Really watching, not just seeing what I expected to see. And I cannot deny that you have been nothing but honest and hardworking and kind since you arrived here. You have not done a single thing to suggest you are the person I accused you of being." She turned to look at Eleanor, her eyes bright with tears. "I think maybe I have been wrong about you. I think maybe I let my hurt and anger blind me to the truth. Thomas played us both false, just like you said. And I took all my rage about that and poured it onto you because you were here and he was not. That was not fair, Eleanor. It was cruel. And I am sorry." Eleanor felt her own tears rising. "Do you really mean that?" "Catherine, do you really believe I'm innocent?" "I do." Catherine's voice was thick with emotion. "And I am so sorry it took me this long to see it. I have wasted 2 years being angry at you when I should have been supporting you. I have cost us both so much time and hurt you in ways I can never fully repair. But if you can forgive me, I want to try to be your sister again. Your real sister, not the bitter stranger I have been." Eleanor threw her arms around Catherine, and they both dissolved into tears, clinging to each other like they used to as children. All the hurt and loneliness and anger of the past 2 years seemed to drain away in that embrace, leaving behind only love and relief and hope for the future. "I forgive you," Eleanor whispered. "I forgive you, Catherine, and I am so grateful to have my sister back." They sat there on the porch step as darkness fell, talking quietly about everything that had happened. Catherine admitted that she had ended things with Thomas herself after discovering his lies, but that she had been too proud and hurt to tell Eleanor the full truth. She confessed that seeing Garrison's faith in Eleanor had made her question her own certainty, that slowly the doubts had crept in until she could no longer maintain her conviction that Eleanor was guilty. "Garrison is a good man," Catherine said finally. "If he cares for you and you care for him, you have my blessing. After everything I have put you through, it is the least I can offer." "Thank you," Eleanor said softly. "That means more than you know." They went inside and prepared a late supper together, talking and laughing like they used to. The cabin that had felt like a prison for the past 6 weeks suddenly felt like a home. And when Eleanor climbed up to the loft that night, she did so with a lighter heart than she had carried in years. The next morning, Eleanor was at her desk in Harrison's office when Garrison arrived. He looked slightly nervous, which was so unlike his usual unshakable calm that it made Eleanor smile. "Good morning," she said warmly. "Morning?" He glanced around to make sure they were alone, then moved closer to the desk. "How did things go with your sister last night?" "Better than I ever dared hope." Eleanor quickly recounted her conversation with Catherine, watching his expression soften as she spoke. "She believes me now, Garrison. She finally understands that I was telling the truth all along, and she gave us her blessing." "That is good news." He reached across the desk and took her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "I'm glad for both of you. Family should not be divided by misunderstandings and lies." They talked quietly for a few more minutes before Mr. Harrison returned, and Eleanor had to release Garrison's hand and return to her work. But the warmth of his touch stayed with her all morning, a constant reminder that she was no longer alone in the world. Over the following weeks, Eleanor and Garrison began courting in earnest. He would call at the cabin to take her walking, always respectful and proper, but with an underlying warmth that made Eleanor's heart race. Catherine proved surprisingly supportive, even inviting Garrison to join them for supper several times. The two had an easy camaraderie born of mutual respect, and it touched Eleanor to see them getting along so well. The settlement had mixed reactions to the courtship. Some people were delighted to see the taciturn mountain man finally showing interest in a woman. Others whispered that Eleanor was too good for someone so rough and uncivilized. But Garrison seemed unconcerned by the gossip, and Eleanor had learned long ago not to care too much about other people's opinions. Jenkins tried to press charges against Eleanor for shooting him, but the sheriff ruled it clear self-defense after hearing Garrison's testimony. Jenkins left Copper Ridge shortly after, cursing Eleanor and Garrison both, but no one was particularly sorry to see him go. November brought heavy snow to the high country, and Garrison began spending more time in the settlement, staying at the boarding house when the weather made the trek back to his mountain cabin too dangerous. He and Eleanor would sit together at quilting circles and church services, and slowly the community began to accept them as a couple. On a cold afternoon in late November, Garrison asked Eleanor to walk with him despite the snow falling gently from a gray sky. They bundled up in coats and scarves and walked to the creek that ran past the settlement, now frozen solid and covered with a blanket of white. "Eleanor, I need to talk to you about something important," Garrison said, his breath misting in the cold air. Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" "I have been thinking about the future, about my cabin up in the high country and whether that is still where I want to live. I built that place when I was younger and angry at the world, looking for solitude and peace, and it served me well for many years, but now—" He turned to face her, his blue eyes intense. "Now I find that solitude does not appeal to me anymore, not when there is the possibility of sharing my life with someone who matters more to me than anything else ever has." "Garrison," Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. He took both her hands in his. "I know we have not been courting long. By conventional standards, I should wait longer before saying this, but I am not a conventional man, and I see no point in pretending I do not know my own heart. I love you, Eleanor Hayes. I love your courage and your honesty and your kindness. I love the way you face adversity with grace and the way you refuse to let injustice break you. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that love every single day." He released one of her hands and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small wooden box. When he opened it, Eleanor saw a simple gold band nestled inside. "It is not fancy. I made it myself from gold I panned years ago, but it is real and it is true, just like my love for you. Will you marry me, Eleanor? Will you be my wife and let me be your husband?" Eleanor was crying, but this time the tears were pure joy. "Yes. Yes, Garrison, I will marry you. I love you too, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You have given me back my faith in honesty and goodness, and I want nothing more than to build a life with you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and then pulled her close, kissing her for the first time. His lips were warm despite the cold air, and the kiss was gentle and reverent, full of promise for the future. Eleanor melted into his embrace, feeling safe and loved and home at last. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and smiling, Garrison said, "I spoke to the preacher yesterday. He can marry us whenever we are ready. I thought perhaps we could wait until spring when the weather is better, but if you want to marry sooner, I am willing." "I do not want to wait," Eleanor said immediately. "Why should we? I know my own heart as well as you know yours. Let us marry as soon as it can be arranged." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Then we will marry next Sunday if the preacher agrees. And I promise you, Eleanor, I will spend every day of our marriage making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret it," she said firmly. "You are the best man I have ever known, Garrison, and I am the luckiest woman in Montana Territory to be loved by you." They walked back to town hand in hand, and when they arrived at the cabin to share the news with Catherine, her sister's genuine happiness for them was the final piece falling into place. Catherine hugged them both and immediately began planning what needed to be done for a wedding on such short notice. The next Sunday dawned clear and cold, with brilliant sunshine sparkling off the snow. The entire settlement seemed to turn out for the ceremony, packing into the back room of the general store until there was barely room to breathe. Eleanor wore her best dress with Catherine's help, and Catherine pinned wild roses in Eleanor's dark hair, dried blooms saved from summer. When Garrison arrived, Eleanor's breath caught. He had trimmed his beard and tied his long hair back, and he wore clean clothes that actually fit his massive frame properly. But it was the expression on his face when he saw her that made Eleanor's heart overflow. He looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, like he could not quite believe his good fortune in winning her hand. The ceremony was simple and brief. The preacher read the traditional vows and asked them to pledge their commitment before God and witnesses. When Garrison spoke his vows, his deep voice was steady and sure, and Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks as she spoke her own promises in return. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher said with a smile. "You may kiss your bride." Garrison cupped Eleanor's face in his huge, calloused hands and kissed her with a tenderness that belied his rough exterior. The room erupted in applause and cheers, and Eleanor laughed against his lips, dizzy with happiness. The celebration afterward was warm and joyful, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Eleanor danced with her new husband, marveling at how graceful he was despite his size. She danced with Mr. Harrison and with Maggie's father, and even with the old preacher who performed the ceremony. And through it all, Catherine beamed with genuine happiness, no trace of bitterness or resentment on her face. As the celebration wound down and darkness fell, Garrison took Eleanor's hand and led her to the boarding house where he had secured a room for their wedding night. It was not fancy, but it was clean and private, and it felt like a palace to Eleanor as Garrison closed the door behind them and pulled her into his arms. "My wife," he murmured against her hair. "I still cannot quite believe it is real." "It is real," Eleanor assured him, tilting her face up for his kiss. "I am yours and you are mine for the rest of our lives." That night they consummated their marriage with tenderness and growing passion, learning each other's bodies and hearts in the flickering candlelight. Garrison was gentle despite his size and strength, always careful not to hurt her, and Eleanor marveled at the intimacy of being so completely known and accepted by another person. This was what love was supposed to be, she thought. Not pretty lies and flowery speeches, but honest commitment and tender care. The next morning they woke tangled together in the narrow bed, and Garrison told her about his plans. "I'm going to sell my mountain cabin and buy land closer to town. Build us a proper house where you can be near your sister and your friends. I do not need the isolation anymore now that I have you." "Are you certain?" Eleanor traced her fingers along his bearded jaw. "I do not want you to give up something important to you. You are what is important to me now. Everything else is just details." He kissed her softly. "Besides, I have been thinking about starting a timber operation. The mountains are full of good trees and the settlements are growing. There is demand for quality lumber. It would be a good business and it would keep me closer to home." "I think that sounds wonderful," Eleanor said, "and I can help with the business side, keeping accounts and managing orders." "Partners in everything," Garrison agreed. "That is how I want our marriage to be. Equal and honest. Always." They stayed at the boarding house for 3 more days, a brief honeymoon before returning to normal life. Catherine had moved Eleanor's belongings from the loft to Garrison's room, and she had prepared the cabin for Eleanor's departure with surprising equanimity. "I will miss having you here," Catherine admitted when they went to collect the last of Eleanor's things. "But I am happy for you, truly. You deserve this happiness after everything you have been through." "You will visit us often," Eleanor insisted, "and once we have our new house built, you must come stay whenever you like. You are family, Catherine. That will never change." Catherine hugged her tightly. "I am so sorry for the time we lost, Eleanor, for not believing you when I should have. I wish I could go back and change it. We cannot change the past, but we can build a better future, and we have time now, all the time in the world, to be sisters again." Garrison found land about 2 miles from town, a beautiful piece of property with a creek running through it and stands of pine that could be harvested for lumber. He began building their house in December, working through the cold weather with a determination that impressed everyone who saw him. Other men from the settlement volunteered to help, and the house went up faster than Eleanor had dared hope. By February it was finished, a solid 2-story cabin with a proper bedroom and a separate room for Eleanor's sewing and Garrison's accounts. There was a large kitchen with a modern stove and a parlor with windows that looked out toward the mountains. It was more than Eleanor had ever dreamed of having, made even more perfect by knowing Garrison had built it with his own hands, specifically for her. They moved in on a bright February afternoon, and that night they christened every room of the house, laughing and loving with the freedom of being alone in their own space at last. Eleanor had never been so happy, so completely content with her life. She had a husband who loved her, a sister who believed in her, friends who accepted her, and a home that was truly hers. All the pain of the past 2 years seemed worth it now, because it had led her here to this moment. Spring came early to Montana that year, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the thawing earth. Garrison's lumber business thrived, and Eleanor managed the accounts and orders with the same skill she had brought to Mr. Harrison's work. They made a good team, anticipating each other's needs and working in harmony toward their shared goals. In April, Eleanor realized she had missed her monthly courses twice running. She said nothing to Garrison at first, not wanting to raise hopes that might be disappointed, but by May there could be no doubt she was carrying their child. She planned carefully how to tell him, wanting to make the moment special. She waited until a warm evening when they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Garrison had his arm around her shoulders, and she was tucked against his side, feeling utterly safe and cherished. "I have something to tell you," she said softly. He looked down at her, his blue eyes curious. "What is it?" "You're going to be a father. We are going to have a baby." For a moment Garrison just stared at her, his expression blank with shock. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming it into something radiant. "Truly? Eleanor, truly?" "Truly," she confirmed, laughing at his obvious joy. "Probably in October or November if I have calculated correctly." He pulled her onto his lap and kissed her thoroughly, his large hands cradling her face like she was made of precious glass. "You have made me the happiest man alive," he said when he finally released her. "A wife I adore, and now a child on the way. I do not deserve such blessings." "You deserve everything good in this world," Eleanor told him firmly. "You are the best man I know, Garrison. Our child will be lucky to have you as a father." The news spread through the settlement quickly, and their friends showered them with congratulations and advice. Catherine was particularly delighted, already making plans to help with the baby when it arrived. She had softened considerably over the past months, and the relationship between the sisters had healed into something even stronger than it had been before Thomas Whitmore drove them apart. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months. She continued working on the accounts until August, when the heat in her growing belly made it too uncomfortable to sit at the desk for long periods. Garrison hovered over her constantly, always worried that she was doing too much or not resting enough. Eleanor found his protectiveness endearing even when it bordered on excessive. In early October, as the aspen leaves turned to gold and the first frost touched the high peaks, Eleanor went into labor. Catherine and Mrs. Brennan attended her while Garrison paced anxiously outside, forbidden from the birthing room by tradition, but clearly desperate to be near his wife. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next afternoon. But finally, as the sun angled toward evening, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby boy with his father's blue eyes and a surprisingly thick head of dark hair. When Garrison was finally allowed into the room and saw his son for the first time, tears streamed down his weathered face unchecked. He held the baby with infinite gentleness, his huge hands cradling the tiny body like it was the most precious thing in existence. "He is perfect," Garrison whispered. "Eleanor, he is perfect." "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked, exhausted but glowing with happiness. Garrison thought for a moment. "James, after my father, if that pleases you." "James Garrison," Eleanor said, testing the name. "I like it. Welcome to the world, little James." The baby squirmed in his father's arms and let out a healthy wail, and they all laughed through their tears. Catherine kissed Eleanor's forehead and congratulated them both, and Mrs. Brennan bustled about making sure everything was in order for the new mother's recovery. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Garrison sat beside Eleanor's bed, holding his son while she rested. "Do you remember the day we met?" he asked softly. "When I defended myself against Jenkins's accusations in the street?" "I remember," Eleanor said. "I thought you handled it with remarkable dignity. I saw you watching me that day, saw something in your eyes that made me curious about who you were. And then I started hearing the things your sister said about you, and I made it my business to observe you for myself. I watched you work hard without complaint. I watched you treat others with kindness, even when you received little kindness in return. And I knew, even before I spoke to you properly, that your sister was wrong, that you were honest and true." He looked up from the baby to meet her eyes. "That is what I want to teach our son, to judge people by their actions, not by others' accusations, to stand up for truth even when it is unpopular, to protect the innocent and defend the vulnerable, to be a man of integrity in a world that often lacks it. Eleanor felt fresh tears slide down her cheeks. "He will learn all that from watching you," she said. "You are all those things, Garrison. You have been from the first moment I saw you." They sat together in the peaceful darkness, their baby sleeping between them, and Eleanor reflected on how much her life had changed in just over a year. She had come to Montana Territory broken and desperate, accused of lies she had never told, estranged from the only family she had left. And now she had everything. A husband who loved her without reservation, a sister who finally believed her, a child to raise and cherish, and a home filled with honest love and solid trust. The journey to reach this place had been painful and difficult, but it had been worth every tear and every moment of doubt, because it had led her to Garrison, to this life, to this moment of perfect contentment. The years that followed were full of joy and growth. Garrison's lumber business flourished, and they became one of the most successful families in Copper Ridge. Eleanor worked alongside her husband, managing the growing business while raising their son. James proved to be a bright, curious child who adored his father and followed him everywhere once he was old enough to toddle around the lumberyard. When James was 3, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine after Eleanor's sister. The elder Catherine was deeply touched by the honor and became the most devoted aunt imaginable, spending hours with her niece and nephew and showering them with affection. 2 years after Catherine's birth, Eleanor had another son, whom they named Thomas, not after the man who had caused so much pain, but after Eleanor's late father, whose full name had been Thomas John Hayes. Garrison understood the significance and supported the choice wholeheartedly, knowing how much Eleanor had grieved her father's death, believing she had died in disgrace. The children grew up healthy and happy, surrounded by love and the wild beauty of Montana. Garrison taught them to respect the mountains and the creatures that lived there. Eleanor taught them to read and write and keep accounts. Together, they taught their children about honesty and integrity and the importance of judging people by their actions rather than others' words. Catherine never married, but she seemed content with her life. She remained close to Eleanor and Garrison, visiting often and playing a vital role in her nieces' and nephews' lives. She and Eleanor would sometimes talk about those dark days after Thomas Whitmore's betrayal, marveling at how much pain a single dishonest man had caused and how close they had come to losing each other forever. "I am grateful every day that Garrison saw your true character when I was too blind and stubborn to see it myself," Catherine said once when the sisters were alone. "If he had not defended you, if he had not made me question my certainty, we might never have reconciled. I might have spent my whole life believing a lie about the person I loved most in the world." "But you did see the truth eventually," Eleanor reminded her. "You chose to believe me, Catherine. Garrison might have planted the seed of doubt, but you are the one who decided to trust me again. That takes courage." The settlement of Copper Ridge grew over the years, transforming from a rough mining camp into a proper town with a school and a church and proper streets. Garrison and Eleanor were pillars of the community, respected for their business acumen and their generosity toward those in need. They never forgot the kindness shown to them by Maggie Cooper and Mrs. Brennan during those early difficult days, and they made sure to extend the same kindness to newcomers and those facing hard times. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrison took Eleanor back to the spot by the frozen creek where he had proposed. It was November again, with snow falling gently from a gray sky just like that day a decade before. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, holding both her hands just as he had then. "Tying yourself to a rough mountain man when you could have had someone more refined?" Eleanor laughed and stood on her toes to kiss him. "I have never regretted it for even a single moment. You are everything I ever wanted in a husband, Garrison. You are strong and honest and true. You have given me a life beyond anything I dreamed possible. How could I ever regret that?" "I love you, Eleanor," he said, pulling her close. "More today than the day I married you, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is my promise to you for the rest of our lives." "And I love you," Eleanor whispered against his chest. "My mountain man, my protector, my partner in everything. Thank you for seeing the truth in me when no one else would. Thank you for believing in me and fighting for me and loving me so completely. You saved my life in more ways than just killing that cougar." They stood together in the falling snow, holding each other close while the mountains watched over them like ancient sentries. And Eleanor thought about that day she had arrived in Copper Ridge, dusty and desperate and so terribly alone. She thought about Catherine's coldness and her own despair at being called a liar by the only family she had left. And she thought about Garrison stepping into her life like a force of nature, seeing her clearly when everyone else saw only distorted reflections of their own assumptions. She thought about him saying, "She has told me nothing but the truth," even when her own sister screamed that she was a liar. She thought about how his faith in her had given her the strength to keep fighting for her innocence, and how that faith had eventually helped Catherine see the truth as well. Sometimes, Eleanor reflected, all it took was one person who truly believed in you to change everything. One person who looked past accusations and assumptions to see who you really were. Garrison had been that person for her, and she had tried to be that person for others in turn. It was a legacy worth passing on to their children and to everyone who came into their orbit. The snow fell heavier now, beginning to cover the ground in white. Garrison pulled back slightly and smiled down at his wife. "We should get back before we are buried in this storm." "Just a few more minutes," Eleanor said. "I want to remember this moment, this place where you asked me to marry you and changed my whole life." "Very well. A few more minutes." He wrapped his arms around her again, sharing his warmth. "But then we go home to our children and our fire and our life together. Because as much as I treasure these memories, I treasure the present even more. Every day with you is a gift, Eleanor." "And every day with you is an adventure," she replied. "Come, let us go home to our family. Let us go live the beautiful life we have built together." Hand in hand, they walked back through the snow toward Copper Ridge, toward the house Garrison had built with his own hands, toward the 3 children waiting for their parents to return, toward Catherine, who would be there for supper and would stay the night because of the weather. They walked toward everything good and true and honest in their lives, leaving behind the pain of the past and embracing the joy of the present. And if anyone had asked Eleanor Hayes Garrison in that moment whether she believed in redemption, in second chances, in the power of honest love to heal old wounds, she would have answered with absolute certainty. Yes. Yes, she believed, because she was living proof that even the darkest circumstances could transform into light when truth finally won out over lies, when love conquered suspicion, and when one brave soul looked past accusations to see the genuine heart beneath. She was living proof that sometimes all it took to change everything was one person bold enough to say, "She has told me nothing but the truth." And in saying that, to give a wrongly accused woman the courage to keep fighting until justice and love prevailed. They reached their house as full darkness fell, smoke curling from the chimney and golden light glowing from the windows. Their children's laughter echoed from inside, and Eleanor felt her heart swell with gratitude for this life, this family, this love that had been worth fighting for. Garrison squeezed her hand once more before opening the door, and Eleanor squeezed back, a silent communication of all the love and trust and partnership that existed between them. Then they stepped inside together, ready to embrace whatever adventures tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that they would face them side by side, honest and true, for the rest of their days.